The sitting is resumed. Senator Haynes.
Thank you for recognizing me, Mr. President. I would like to take this as my first opportunity to address the chamber. I would like to take the opportunity to say that I'm so glad to be back. I'm so glad to be reappointed. I'm truly humbled by the opportunity that has been given to me by the Prime Minister to return here. I would like to congratulate you on your elevation once again.
Thank you.
To open, I want to contextualize my speech by first of all saying that it must be the challenge of a lifetime for any government to have to try to plan a budget where you are hoping to maintain the social safety net and the social benefits and the social good that people have become accustomed to in a post-independence Barbados in the context of having lost almost $2 billion in projected revenue since the beginning of the pandemic. Gandhi said, "All compromise is based on give and take," but he insisted that there can be no compromise on the fundamentals. Fundamentals that this government has aimed to protect in spite of the economic devastation include ensuring that over 60,000 Barbadians can continue to access free education from nursery right up to tertiary level. Fundamentals like our commitment to ensuring a cleaner and more efficient public transportation service by investing in 49 electric buses. And fundamentals like directing $42 million to the Household Mitigation Unit to ensuring that the most vulnerable families in this country do not fall through the cracks. I was most heartened by this particular announcement that came in the recent budget, and that was that there will be a removal of value-added tax from menstrual products, baby supplies, personal hygiene items. And this is something that's truly dear to my heart. I would like to believe that when VAT was first implemented, that this was something that was clearly overlooked, but it is said that women generally lead with more empathy and tend to consider a wider cross-section of the population. So I would like to commend the government for making the decision to make a call that will clearly impact every household in this country. A number of organizations, including Seroptimist, the Barbados Association of Endometriosis and Polycystic Ovarian Syndrome, the National Organization of Women, and my own Ladybox Project have been lobbying for a long time. And what the data is showing us is that, on average, every woman of reproductive age in this country, and there are about 60,000 Barbadians of reproductive age, are spending $28 a month trying to support their menstrual hygiene needs. Even more expensive than that are the cost of raising a small child, and I would know. The cost of Pampers, formula, and other essential baby items is quite prohibitive. And even as a professional working woman, it is not lost on me that it could be increasingly challenging, especially when we consider that during the course of the pandemic, women disproportionately were impacted by higher levels of unemployment. It's estimated that a woman who's working minimum age will have to spend roughly over 5 hours in order to make the money to cover her basic menstrual hygiene needs. Beyond the concept of period poverty, though, I believe that what needs to be addressed is that in all of these situations, if a woman has to consider between buying Pampers or Desitin or formula, when you consider what her wider living and social circumstances are, we need to kind of broaden the scope for supporting women in particular, especially considering how they've been disadvantaged during the time of the pandemic. Earlier, my colleague, Senator Boyce, would have spoken to the fact that it's World Down Syndrome Day, and I wanted to spend a little time focusing on the challenges that children with neurodevelopmental disorders face. I too have had personal experience dealing with this because my son is autistic. And one thing that I have learned through the exercise of trying to get him assessed, trying to find suitable scope for getting counseling and finding therapists locally to help to support him in his early stages, is that there are severe deficiencies, I would say, both in the private and public sectors. When we first noticed challenges with him, one of the first things was that he was starting to say simple words at around age 2, and it actually coincided with the start of the pandemic. Initially, we just supposed that perhaps perhaps it was related to the fact that he was not allowed to go to nursery at the time and he was at home a lot. But he started to lose his words gradually and just kind of retreated to himself and started using gesturing and not using any words at all. It was his pediatrician who, first of all, flagged what it could be. And I think that for me, even as a physician by training, you don't want to believe that this could happen to your child, but we do need a wider public sensitization effort so that young parents can understand the signs to look for, because as with most conditions, earlier intervention usually tends to mean more successful outcomes. The Ministry of Education has committed to increasing its budget, however, in special needs education. They're sending about 15 teachers, I understand, to be taught intensively in a technique called TEACH, T-E-A-C, 2 H's, double H. And that is a special education program that's formulated just for children with autism. What we do know based on data out of the Centers for Disease Control is that levels of autism are rising in the United States. There's a relative deficiency of data for our population, but between 2014 and 2021, there's been a 10% increase in autism cases in the United States. So the condition is on the rise, and it would require our heightened level of vigilance and awareness in order to ensure that these children can be supported and that they don't fall through the cracks and that they can find a way to navigate life in a safe way and that they can ultimately become productive citizens. One of the other issues that has emerged during the COVID-19 pandemic is an emergence of a mental health crisis as well. The WHO is estimating that there's been about approximately a 25% increase in the prevalence of anxiety and depression worldwide. Obviously, this would have been related to issues such as widespread lockdowns, constraints on people's ability to work due to job displacements, challenges in terms of engaging with loved ones, families, and friends, bereavement, losing loved ones as well. There is a commitment on the part of the Ministry of Health and Wellness to build out their mental health programs. What is a challenge that they've had, though, is that at the same time that mental health issues were starting to peak, the access to services was actually being disrupted because the pandemic meant that the usual outpatient clinics that would have been easier to access in earlier times were not as available to the people who tended to need it. Some of the suggestions that I would have, because I think that mental health generally has been underserved, I think there's a lot more that we could do. One of the things that I think that we absolutely need to look into is at least having a mental health hotline where someone who's in a crisis or their family members can have quick access to a phone number where they can speak to a professional or someone that's trained in emergency mental health management. I also think that because of the seriousness of our mental health crisis, the number of suicides among young people, among young women, we saw the suicide of a young mother recently who left 2 very young twin children and young men as well. It is something that needs to be addressed. I do believe that similar to how we have signs up everywhere reminding people to wear masks, wash your hands, we could also have signs or infomercials where we're telling people as much as possible, pick up the phone, call a loved one, check in on them, get exercise, try to maintain a healthy sleep pattern if you can. These are simple measures that can be taken, but more comprehensively, I do believe that we need to look seriously at considering a national mental health policy. It's something that I think most people at some point of their life would have struggled with. Depression and anxiety go much deeper than just having a bad day, but considering how pervasive it is and considering that we're losing so many young people especially, and young people who have dependents to mental health issues, I do think that it is something that needs to be placed on the front burner. One other measure that I was very, very pleased with is the introduction, or the sweet drink tax, the tax on sugar sweetened beverages was introduced in 2015, but we have sought to increase the tax on sugar sweetened beverages. And some of the data that I found through the Heart and Stroke Foundation actually showed that when the 10% tax went on, the purchase of sugar sweetened beverages actually fell by roughly 4.7%, while simultaneously there was a commensurate increase in the sales of bottled water by about 7.5%, and other non-sugar sweetened beverages, those sales went up by about 5.2%. So as much as there's been quite a bit of concern in the public domain about the tax just being about the government making money, this is actually a part of our broader commitment to being proactive about reducing our NCD burden. You might be aware with the figures that are usually tossed about, which is that about 8 in every 10 deaths in Barbados is related to an NCD, and 1 in every 3 Barbadian children is either obese or overweight, predisposing them to non-communicable diseases in later life. This is something that we need to definitely put back on the front burner. When I first became a senator, myself and young diabetes advocate Crystal Boyer, we were recruited by the Heart and Stroke Foundation to do schools assemblies where we would go into school halls on mornings and actually educate children on nutrition package labeling and generally trying to advise them, well, kids of a certain age shouldn't have more than 10 grams of sugar a day. This is how much sugar is in this particular drink. This is how much sugar is in this particular drink. So you don't want to have 2 sets of fizzy drink per day. You want to cut back on that, maybe use it as a treat, or ideally not use it at all. But it's that kind of early intensive education of our young people in terms of their dietary habits and their lifestyle choices that's going to set the stage in years to come for ultimately a healthier population. Because when we consider the burden of disease in terms of productivity on a national level, in terms of early loss of life, people ending up on dialysis or losing limbs and therefore not being able to participate actively in the workforce. That is a challenge that I believe that this small but simple step will definitely help to bring some improvement to. But obviously, we need a whole of society, whole of government approach in trying to tackle an issue as broad in scope as our NCD problem. I can't speak about NCDs without touching a bit on agriculture. Obviously, during the pandemic, the calls have been there for we need to improve our food and nutrition security. The supply chain issues have been well documented, from trying to get ventilators to trying to get pharmaceuticals to trying to get different types of food. I remember friends complaining that their favorite brands of coffee were no longer available in the supermarket and that kind of thing. So it's more and more important, the kinds of relationships that we're seeing built in order to ensure that we have a consistent, healthy food supply. So the recently signed Brokopondo agreement and the agreements with Kenya in order to exchange technical expertise and so on in agriculture are really important. But the way that we farm also matters. I have been enlightened recently to something called regenerative agriculture. And it has convinced me that we have been doing it wrong all this time. So traditional techniques like tilling the soil and breaking it up actually leads to increased evaporation of water from the soil, increases the risk then that when the rain falls, that soil will become eroded. But what we have neglected to treat to is that soil is alive. So one interesting stat that I saw is that a handful of soil contains more living microorganisms than every human that has ever lived on the planet. And what these organisms are actually doing, they're actually responsible for drawing carbon dioxide out of our atmosphere. So since the start of the industrial age, over 1,000 gigatons of CO2 have been pumped into the planet's atmosphere. And that's responsible ultimately for the levels of global warming that are now there. Ultimately, there's been a major push to reduce CO2 emissions, but some quarters are saying the damage is already done. So there's a new type of thinking that speaks to something called carbon sequestration, where we're now seeing that if we can restore the planet's topsoil, it should actually, within about 20 years, start to cool the planet by drawing down some of what they call the carbon debt. So some of the CO2 that's been pumped into the atmosphere 50, 100 years ago, we can actually draw down by restoring topsoil. It sounds super simple, but one of the main ways that we can actually do this is by not tilling. There's a group in St. Andrew at Walker's Reserve, and they actually practice what's called regenerative agriculture. So they grow various types of crops together. When it's done in other countries, what they do is allow the cows to graze the fields, and you plant trees and different crops, and everything is basically up together. It's called a food forest of sorts. But that way you actually save and preserve the soil. So recently, some of you might have seen that Masha Montano was here with Sadhguru, and they had signed they're part of a movement called Save Soil, but they signed an agreement of sorts where they're trying to establish a movement where they're speaking to soil conservation in this way. And an island as small as Barbados, we don't know how impactful it's going to be, but I think it's a major statement that we're not just asking industrialized nations to make that step, but we're demonstrating that in whatever small way that we're serious about the environment and about conservation. Now, to delve into health a little more, I wanted to speak to a couple of issues, including, first of all, COVID. We can't have a conversation about health right now without addressing COVID. The level of investment that has had to be made between setting up Harrison's Point and the other isolation facilities has been significant. One of the things that it has actually done is that it has hampered access to other health services. So one of the concerns that the general public is continuing to speak about are delays and wait times when they go to clinic or being rescheduled from clinic, surgical wait times. But it has to be contextualized in terms of what we've been facing for the last while. I think that Senator Maynard's points were very well made in terms of we have some very highly qualified and highly skilled medical professionals working at the hospital, and we need to recapitalize the QEH so that those persons have what they need to do their work. I know that efforts have been underway to reduce cardiac deaths. The ambulances have been equipped with things including an auto pulse. They've trained the EMTs in newer up-to-date techniques in terms of cardiac life support, and live information can be shared from the ambulances live and direct to the cardiac suite and to the emergency room at the hospital. But ultimately, I think that you want to make the investments there, of course, but if we can save in 10, 15, 20 years by ensuring that ultimately we have a healthier population through healthier nutrition, greater physical activity, that is definitely the way that we want to go. So I think that even the decision to appoint a special minister assigned with a particular focus on NCDs and the QEH was a clear indication of the direction that we want to take it. With regards to wait times as well, what is not recognized by a lot of people is that it's challenging to manage beds. Unless there are beds upstairs, we can't move patients' admissions up from the emergency room to medical, surgical, pediatric floors. One of the challenges that we're having is that there are elderly for cares, basically old people who presented with perhaps a medical issue but have ultimately recovered and no one has come back for them. On any given day, there could be about 30 elderly or young for cares who are taking up bed space. It's not their fault, it's just what it is. But efforts are actually underway. I understand that there's a facility being renovated in St. Lucie that they're going to try to seek to transfer some of these patients out to in order to alleviate some of the bed management situation at the hospital. So hopefully once that is in place, we'll see a better throughput of patients in the A&E. Sometimes people are also waiting for diagnostics to come through, waiting to see a specialist, and so on. So just to offer a bit of clarity there, obviously we've heard of the plans as well to build out a new geriatric hospital. The current geriatric hospital has a bed capacity of about 278, while the new facility will have about 400 beds. So with the understanding that we're going through a demographic shift, we understand we're having an aging population, and this is going to become more and more of an issue over time. I think it's very forward-thinking to make those preparations from now, and I will extend the call that I heard from someone in the Well of Parliament to encourage any of my colleagues who want to specialize in geriatric medicine to make that call now. While I was on agriculture, I actually wanted to make a quick point with regards to the Graham Hall Nature Sanctuary and the wider Graham Hall area. So it's roughly 81 acres that is partly privately owned, which is the Nature Sanctuary, and partly government owned. We know over the years that there's been a bit of sewage runoff into the swamp that has been impacting the flora, the fauna, the fish that live there. Graham Hall is our last remaining large mangrove, and I appeal to us to protect that area. Mangroves actually serve a key role as fish nurseries. Mangrove root systems actually have the ability to filter CO2. It's absolutely incredible. I took a tour recently and I was so enlightened by this natural ecosystem. And I was also very disheartened to see what a poor state it is in. And I think that there's a lot more that we could do to protect our natural environment in a way that benefits not just the fish and the birds, but also could be a wonderful attraction for tourists if you want to look at it from an economic standpoint. But how we treat our natural heritage, I think, is absolutely vital. And it reflects on us. I am going to conclude at this point, Mr. President. I thank you for your indulgence.
Thank you very much, Senator Dr. Hayes. Senator Dr. Mulroney.
Thank you, Mr. President, for acknowledging me and providing me with the opportunity to speak in this honorable chamber. It is my maiden speech, so let me say that I look forward to the opportunity to make tangible contributions to what we will be doing here as part of the national project. I also want to say that I look forward to the dialogue and cooperation that will happen in this chamber amongst colleagues from both sides. And I say that with truth, because as a political scientist with a particular orientation, I do not step away from the trust of debate and different perspectives. I believe that particularly now as we are in this moment, we, the country, needs all of the voices and the different perspectives that are going to be important in order for us to be able to move again on this national project. We may not necessarily all agree, but the fact that all ideas and perspectives contend in this chamber will suggest, again, that we are contributing to the tangible nature of a good democracy. Mr. President, I think that everything that we've said over the last couple of days, Friday and even today, suggests that there is some consensus that Barbados is at a particular moment. It is a particular moment, and I heard one of the senators, the colleagues indicate, not of our making. Yeah? We have found ourselves in the flux of a particular set of circumstances. Many of them, again, not of our own making, many of them due to endogenous things, but also as well exogenous factors as well. The notion that when the world sneezes, Barbados will catch a cold, perhaps in the context of COVID was almost literal, but in truth, it speaks again to the nature of our insertion in the world economy. So not only have we had to face the hurricane, the freak storms, and all those other things, but we're also facing an unfriendly international environment. I hope that we have not forgotten that it was in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic in October of 2020, as we were trying to recover, that we were unfairly blacklisted by the EU for a historical period 2015 to 2018, even though the country was adjudged as being partially compliant in 3 of the 10 areas, meaning we were compliant in 7 and blacklisted in 3. A country in the midst of a COVID pandemic that was trying to take care of its population, but was then blacklisted. It speaks, again, to the nature of how we are inserted into the world economy as a small state. On the one hand, in the international realm, we are urged to work together. But what the COVID pandemic, Mr. President, also showed us was, again, that contradiction. On the one hand, we work together at the UN system, but on the other hand, in the context of a pandemic, we also experience what I call vaccine apartheid, where countries had access to vaccine based on geography, based on wealth, but not based on fairness all of the time. And I say these things not because there's an attempt to excuse government for any kind of, failing, but to speak to the reality of the context that we are in, and that there are international forces and international things that are happening that as a country we are also having to respond to. We face an international community, Mr. President, that is becoming more and more impatient with the notion that we need to be able to speak to the historical trauma of colonialism, even though we are participating in a neo-colonial framework. But they say to us, that is no longer relevant, Mr. President. They say to us, regardless of the fact that we are a small nation, that they, even though many of the problems and issues and concerns and challenges that we are now having to address, many of them are historical. And whereas before we could look to the international community for assistance, they tell us that those arguments are no longer relevant. So that in the context even of the European Union, again, and not picking on them, the framework that used to provide assistance for small states like Barbados, because again of that historical time, is no longer available. It has been dismantled because they tell us we should now have the capacity to be pulling ourselves up by our own bootstraps, Mr. President. And again, I frame this context because it's important for us to understand the things that we have to respond to. Because in a moment such as this that we are in, it is not only about the challenges that we face, but it's about how we respond, Mr. President. The way a country responds to the moment that it is faced with says something about its character, says something about its backbone and its intestinal fortitude, and it can serve to galvanize its people. And I want to suggest to this honorable chamber that what the government has done in the context of its response is to be able to signal something to the world about who we are as a Barbados and as Barbadians. And what it signals, Mr. President, is that even in the context of the challenges that we face, that we will not retreat. We will go boldly. The Lower Chamber, some refer to this program as audacious. And it is audacious because the government is seeking to balance a number of different things. It has to raise revenue. But this government is saying to the world and saying to Barbadians that even in the context of doing that, we are intentional about the fact that we will leave no one behind. Because we understand that even if we get the macroeconomic fundamentals right, even if we are able to balance and even if we are able to bring in the right amount of revenue, if we do so, and the fella from Nelson Street and the girl that live out there in Bush Hall don't feel that she belongs in this Barbados, then we will not have gotten it right. We will not have gotten it right. So that the government program, when you look at it, seeks to establish that fundamental balance that is intended to bring, and I'll use the word, fairness. And I use words like this deliberately, because again, you know we can get very kind of strict and we want to talk about the esoteric things of, the economy and the revenue and that sort of stuff, but there are some fundamental moral things that a country has to do, that a country has to show through in its character. And one of them has to be fairness to its population, because that compact that a government has, and particularly a government like this one with the majority that it has, with the resounding victory that it has to show that it is sensitive, Mr. President. That it is sensitive to the population, how it wields that power. And so that when you look at the measures that are contained therein within the appropriation bill, the underlying tenet there, Mr. President, is one of fairness. It is one of fairness. Yeah. That notion that we leave no one behind is a notion that the international community has come around to in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals. And it's a notion that recognizes that sustainable development, again, is not only about the macroeconomics, but that development is nuanced. And that therefore the treatment of it needs to be nuanced. You can't take care of one end without taking care of the other. Whether it's the environment, it's the people, it's the economy, everything works together. And that there must be a balance. And so that, Mr. President, underlying, again, and I talked about that response and what it shows in the character and the intestinal fortitude of a government, in its response, we have some principles that are emerging, and I spoke to one which is about fairness. But I also want to speak to another principle that the government is moving to, and it's shown in the context of the measures within the appropriation bill, and that is transparency. There was a discussion, I believe on Friday, that asks us, in the context of the budget, where are the clear outputs? Where are the objectives? How do we know that the government is spending the money? How will we know, Mr. President, that we have achieved a particular goal? And I want to say that this is something that the government is working hard. If you look within the estimates, you would notice that the government is intending to establish a department called Commitment for Results, CFR, Commitment for Results. And that name says something. The Commitment for Results is a framework that the government is putting in place in order to ensure that the public service identifies its key objectives, its output, essentially its KPIs, and that government departments will have to, because we have institutionalized the CFR process within the government framework, and more importantly, within the estimates framework. So it means that in the context of the preparation of budgets for the estimates from now on, the Cabinet has agreed that we will make changes to the Public Finance Act 2019 to make it mandatory that all government departments, even including SOEs, once they receive funding from government, must use the CFR framework in order to prepare their estimates. And further, if that was it, Mr. President, we could drop the mic and go along. But further to that, the government will ensure that these CFRs are made public. You don't have to wait until the estimates debate. You will not have to wait until the estimates debate, Mr. President. The public will be able to have sight of these documents so that for themselves, they will be able to see exactly what government departments have prioritized. Because the CFR framework, you have to weight your priorities, you have to indicate your clear objectives, your outputs, your outcomes, and then you got to put the money alongside it. So that the public then can look and see what is being achieved or what I said I would achieve against the money that is allocated and be able to follow, monitor, and measure. Fairness, transparency, open to the public. Further than that, the government has also just recently signed with the Inter-American Development Bank a technical cooperation for something called an investment map. What the investment map will do is that, again, it will make public all of government's infrastructural projects, all, A-L-L, all of government's infrastructural projects, so that the average citizen can go and upload pictures. If the road that I promised you in St. Thomas ain't get done in 6 months, you can take a picture, load it up there, make a complaint, and say, well, you ain't finished this road in time. Transparency, Mr. President. This government is intentional in its efforts to make sure that in the wielding of its power, it remains true to the compact that it has with its citizens and their right to be able to hold this government to account. Fairness and transparency. Fundamental principles, Mr. President, of how we are working. The other principle that I want to speak to is the principle, and I'm going to call it a principle, is transformation. I want to suggest that what we have in the context of this appropriation bill is a transformative agenda. And again, I use that word deliberately, Mr. President, because transformation means something. It connotes a change in something such that somebody looking at that thing might not be able to recognize it because it has so been transformed. And it stands in opposition to the notion of a tinkering, a slight change. It's a transformation. And that transformational agenda can be seen through the several silent revolutions that the government is undertaking in the context of this budget. And again, Mr. President, I have to stop and make the point that again, while we are focusing, yes, on getting the macroeconomic fundamentals correct, what this government is showing, Mr. President, it also understands that there are some fundamental things that if you don't get them correct at the lower level, that your success at the other level will not be sustainable. So that the quiet revolutions that this government is undertaking in a number of different areas is intended to undergird, Mr. President, undergird the measures that we are putting in place to stabilize the economy. A full understanding that everything is interconnected. It is interconnected. We are accustomed to working in silos, so there has been a traditional approach, which means that we tax as the only way to fix. But this transformational agenda by this government, again, seeks to do the opposite. Seeks to ensure, again, that we can emphasize that interconnectedness that is important for sustainable development, sustainable long-term growth, the sustainable achievement of the things that the government will want to do. I want to speak specifically in this context to the training revolution that is taking place across many ministries and departments of government. And I want to speak particularly to some training initiatives that are happening under the National Training Initiative, NTI. Now, NTI was established to make sure that we can make workers in Barbados fit for purpose. And you may ask, Mr. President, when you say fit for purpose, what do you mean? Fit for purpose means that these workers are able to operate in a context that is continually evolving. The revolution that we are doing in training is not meant to only fix problems of today or to address problems of today, but a revolution that will allow workers in Barbados to be able to operate in the Barbados of the future. Mr. President, remember that I started by saying your response says something about you. Your response says something about your character. It speaks to who you are now, but also who you will be in the future. And so that the responses that we are undertaking in the context of these silent revolutions are about propelling us into the future. Under the National Training Initiative, Mr. President, to date, we have trained over 45,000 Barbadians. I'll say it again, 45,000 Barbadians. And that does not include, Mr. President, an additional 20,000 that will be given free scholarships in Paradise Village and Paynes Bay and Rock Hall, because there's no discrimination. 20,000 scholarships to train through a partnership with Coursera. And I must say, Mr. President, I've got to take a few minutes here, because Coursera has linkages with some of the top universities all over, Harvard, whatever. And so that it means then that Barbadians who perhaps were not at the time able to get the academics correct have an opportunity through the NTI, through these scholarships, to then go to some of the top universities. It is equalizing opportunities in Barbados. What we are doing is not for now. We are preparing for the future. This government is full aware that when you invest in training, you might not see the results now. You're going to see those results later. But we do it anyhow because it's a transformational agenda. Under the NTI, as I said, 45,000 trained, Mr. President, over $6.2 million worth of training, $6.2 million. Free courses across. Under that program, over 2,000 Hatal workers have been trained across 57 properties in areas designed to not only propel them, but propel the tourism sector, to prepare it for growth and for change. Under that NTI program, opportunities in the creative sector. And again, sometimes we talk about training, you know, we think that people going into a little classroom, they can sit down. No. What NTI does is make sure that we use new technologies and new ways of learning that are adapted specifically for the learners that we have. And so that the courses are offered online and you get credit for them immediately and offered in tranches that make them relevant and user-friendly, Mr. President. And I want to emphasize here that one of the courses that is offered specifically on the NTI platform is a course in civics. And it may surprise us, Mr. President, to note that that is one of the most subscribed courses that is offered because Barbadians want to understand how this country runs and where they find themselves situated in it. Over 13,000 persons subscribing to a course online in civics. And areas relevant, Mr. President, financial management, occupational safety. We are talking about the sewing and the, no offense to anybody who, I can't sew, so I may not think that is relevant, Mr. President. So I don't want to insult anybody. But we're talking about new areas of economic activity, that this government is being intentional in making sure that citizens are trained. I'm going to say that again, intentional, because we haven't done it by accident. The partnership with COSERA wasn't an accident. It was deliberate, because we understand that the transformational agenda was not for now, Mr. President. It is for the future. And again, if all I did was talk about the training that we are offering under NTI, I could sit down and go home. But if I begin to talk about the training that is happening again across all the ministries and departments of this government, then you would have to know that this government understands fundamentally that training and preparation for its workforce is critical. It's critical to the national project that we are doing. And Mr. President, I can't start to calling the ministry names because I don't know if there's anything in the standing orders that can help protect me from my colleagues in cabinet when they start to buff me and tell me that I ain't mentioned them. So I don't want to start to call names of ministries that are also offering training, but just to say that right across ministry departments, again, being intentional. The government is being intentional about this cause. To the extent, Mr. President, that an OECD report in November of 2020, when it was looking at what governments are doing innovatively to recover, identified two things. One, investing in your citizens in order to upskill them. Barbados wasn't there. Innovative things that governments are doing, investing in your citizens in order to upskill them and investing in the public sector. Two things that this government is doing. as part of its transformational agenda. Mr. President, I want to speak as well to the silent revolution that is happening in the context of culture within this country. I am one of those who believe that culture is the underpinning. It is the fundamental underpinning of what holds a country together. If you look at countries that have done well, it is because their citizens have an intrinsic understanding of who they are. So that when they come and they face a challenge, the citizens in the country respond in a way and you know that is that country. And you can hear a resounding sound that comes from that country that says, these people are of one voice and are of one mind. Those countries that are failing, it is where the culture is beginning to unravel and there's no longer a consensus of what holds the country together. What this government is seeking to do is to ensure that we once again solidify, rebuild, revitalize that cultural ethos in the people of Barbados. We can get, Mr. President, I keep repeating it, all of the macro fundamentals correct. We can raise all of the revenue. We can come back from the brink. But if we do not pay attention to the people, if we do not pay attention to those things that hold us together, that bind us together, it will unravel. So that the cultural revolution that is intended by this government is not about bacchanalia. It ain't about crop over, Mr. President. As much as those things are important, we're talking about a holistic cultural revolution that seeks to reposition history. Seeks to reposition history, Mr. President. And sometimes we don't like to hear about it because history is painful. But history is also what reminds us and what will inform us of the things that we ought to be careful of and also frame where we should hang our hat in the future. So that the cultural revolution that this government is going to be able, that this government is not going to be able, that this government is undertaking, is intended to ensure that Barbadians have a sense of pride in who they are and their history as well. Our history has been framed by history books, which will have us as victims at many levels. And while that might be true, there are also stories of victories and successes and things that we have conquered. And the Cultural Revolution will allow us to also raise them to high esteem as well. It is for this reason that this government has been intentional about the relationship that it's building in Africa. And some, if you are short-sighted, will look at that and say it's just trips. But that is for the short-sighted, Mr. President. And we don't have many of those in Barbados because Barbadians understand fundamentally, Mr. President, that the linkage with Africa is about reframing and reigniting. What we are doing in Ghana, for instance, is fundamental in relation to our culture and the reframing of our history. We are reclaiming those bonds. And not only from the historical perspective, but we are creating new ones, Mr. President. The Division of Culture will very soon be signing an MOU with the Ministry of Culture in Ghana, because we understand that there are things that we have that are so familiar and similar. There are people who have said to me that they've been to Ghana and they felt like they're walking in any district in Barbados. So that MOU will allow us to be able to further explore those ties and those bonds. Mr. President, there are plans to twin Spikestown with Cape Coast. Again, because of the history that is there between those two countries, Mr. President. MOUs are being signed with the Ministry of Agriculture from Barbados and the ministry in Ghana. There are planned exports of products, Mr. President, planned airlift, the cultural revolution, the transformation that this government is on, Mr. President, is not only about now, but about the future. Generations of Barbadians will look on at what we are doing now and be able to benefit. But I've talked about Ghana, Mr. President, what it is that we are doing at home. In the spirit of reframing that cultural heritage and the strength of culture in Barbados, we are grounding the Crop Over Festival in a season of emancipation. In a season of emancipation, so that Barbadians can be reminded that Crop Over is not only about the whining and the drinking, but that there was a historical reason for the crop being done. So that the raising of the hands can have meaning. And that the season of emancipation takes Barbadians on a journey to remember all of the significant moments that has shaped and forged this country, Mr. President. And you would think that something like that is simple. A few events here, a few events there, when they call it season of emancipation, a long march here and a long march there. But Mr. President, anybody who says that underestimates the value of a people that have a sense of belonging. They underestimate the value of a people who know implicitly who they are, Mr. President. And so that the cultural revolution that we are intending to take this country on will allow us to be able to build out the creative economy, will allow us to provide space for creatives in this country to be able to blossom. One of the pet projects that, as I've come into, and I'm calling it a pet project, I've not been there long, but it's a pet project to me, is the Rock Hall Freedom Park, Mr. President. And very soon, in the middle of April, actually it will be one of the signal events in the season of emancipation, we will be launching the second phase of the Rock Hall Freedom Park. And I signal that out, Mr. President, as a pet project, because we are intending within the division to make that an example of community tourism. Because when we talk about culture, in many respects, we also talk about tourism. And some people would suggest, oh, that all we want to do is make money and, export it and have the tourists come, etc. But we are intending to build out an authentic story of Barbadian culture that Barbadians own. I can say it again, that Barbadians own and participate in. The new culture tourism milieu is not about tourists coming here and going to Atals and getting in a bus and driving around and saying, "Ooh, that looks pretty." That's the tourism of the past. the transformational agenda that we are doing in the context of culture intends to ground it within the communities of Barbados. And so that the Rock Hall Freedom Park, the vision for that is that it becomes community-owned. That it's not something that people descend on and take out, but that it will benefit the community directly. An exemplar for community tourism. We're transforming the nature of tourism that we had before, Mr. President. It is a transformational agenda such that the thing will look different, that you don't know what it was before. I can talk about the fact that we are developing a national register of significant places so that the homes and communities of Barbados past can be preserved, that we can collect the stories, Mr. President, so that those stories are not lost. The Cultural Revolution is about tying us to the past as we move forward. So that national register, Mr. President, will allow us to ensure that in 20, 30 years' time, my grandchildren and great-grandchildren, God willing, God willing, will be able to have that history at their fingertips and be able to look back and say, this is where this was. This is where Grantley Adams lived. This is where Arabaro lived. This is where Sagari lived, because we're also doing it as well for all of the national heroes, so that we have students from the university going out into communities and collecting these stories together, Mr. President. We're doing it differently. It's a transformational agenda so that the benefit is shared. The benefit is shared. Mr. President, I also want to speak to the agenda that the government is doing that is also about modernization, and it's extremely important. Because I believe that this is also one of the important areas that undergirds how the government is working, how the government is intending to move forward and move this country forward. And when we talk about modernization, we often sometimes mean a repudiation of everything that is past for something that is necessarily new. And the modernization of the agenda of the government is not intended necessarily to repudiate everything, but it is to build on what we have to improve it. We heard questions this morning about efficiency and how we will be able to either access information and have decisions made in a timely manner. The modernization agenda is intended, and I hope you're following me, Mr. President, with the thread that I am making, is the response that will tell people about who we are now, but also in the future. We're building a transformational agenda. We're changing the thing. So that the intent of the modernization agenda is to ensure that we can enhance the functioning of the government as a whole for the benefit of people, so that the interface is easier, so that people can have access. It is for this reason why we have a dedicated senior minister within the Prime Minister's office responsible for infrastructure, so that all of the projects that the government is intended to roll out can be done efficiently, Mr. President. And that senior minister is responsible for working with the Town and Country Planning Department to work through the kinks, to try to make sure the process moves as efficiently and as quickly as it should, in order that we can be able to progress. It's like building planks. one minister whose day-to-day job for infrastructure is lifting that thing up so that it can be propelled forward. That's one plank. That's one plank in the modernization journey. The other plank, as my colleague spoke to, is the fact that we are digitizing records across ministries. And again, people who do not understand that agenda may just say, oh, they can just put some records here. What do I mean? But if you can understand that when you digitize these records, it makes them more accessible. Modernization, we come back to that principle also of transparency. Because if they're more accessible, they're not only accessible to the public servants who need them, but then they can become accessible to the public as well. The modernization agenda, changing the thing, transformation such that you cannot necessarily tell what it looked like originally. It is those threads, Mr. President, that are fundamentally important. And this digitization agenda that is happening in terms of the records, again, are about ensuring efficiency and effectiveness. And the government is engaging, again, technical cooperation, being intentional about it, not just saying it because we're accustomed to saying it. We talk about the implementation deficit. Good ideas, good ideas, Mr. President, with poor execution. This government is being intentional about the things that it's saying that it will do. On the one hand, here, we have the things that we say that we will do. On the other hand, we have the implementation. And we have a cabinet and a government that is organized, leaner to be able to deliver. And that is how we are going to be held accountable. The extent that we are able to deliver, Mr. President. I want to come back, Mr. President, if you will allow me, because I think in the context of talking about culture, I forgot another pet project, sorry. In the context of culture, I perhaps have many of those. The Prime Minister talks quite passionately about the road project, right? Reclaiming our Atlantic Destiny Road. I'm sure you guys have heard the Prime Minister talk about this millions of times, because that's her passion project. But one of the areas for me that is also critically important as we talk about digitization is the fact that we'll be digitizing thousands upon thousands of records in the archives department. You know, when I first visited the archives department, and I'm going to be very honest, I was trying to remember when I visited the archives department as a student, and I couldn't remember. That had to be years and years ago, and I'm not dating myself, please and thank you. But I hadn't been to the archives department for a long, long, long time. And I was amazed at the millions of records in that archives department, Mr. President, and to learn that there are countries, even countries in Africa, who have lost their historical records, who are now coming to the archives department in Barbados to see what we have. And through the process of digitizing them, we are then creating another kind of economy, an archival economy, Mr. President. An archival economy, so that we are building different layers. And in that effort, we are also preserving our history. We are also preserving our history, Mr. President. Finally, Mr. President, I want to close by saying something. As you know, I would have just recently joined this government, and you know, I've worked in the development sector for the majority of my life, and so advocacy and the issues of women and young people and the issues of empowerment have been issues that I have worked all my life on in terms of ensuring and advocating for. And I must say without reserve, and anybody who knows me know that I am not effusive with praise just because, yeah? That I am proud to be part of a government that in the context of its estimates and revenue expenditure was able to look and say, we are not just, again, about applying whole of country approaches, but we will look and see those within our population that are the most vulnerable. And Senator Haynes talked about it, but I'm just re-emphasizing. That a government will look and understand that there's something vulnerable about girls and women and taking care of those fundamental things that are important for them. That a government will look and say, let's look at the issue of NCDs. Being intentional about development. Being intentional about its people. Being intentional that no one is left behind in this national project, Mr. President. It is something that I am proud to be part of, Mr. President, because it speaks to a government that cares. And in this world, caring is not something that comes easy anymore. We are about the individual, the self, how will we attain? So a government that not only says that it cares, but shows that it cares by what it does, is one that we should hold in high esteem. Mr. President, I thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Monroe-Knight. Senator Kevin Boyce.
Thank you, Mr. President, for the recognition. And I must say I thoroughly enjoyed the most robust, Senator Nichols, a most robust presentation by Senator Monroe-Knight. And the reason I just stopped Senator Nichols from leaving the chamber, Mr. President, or requested that he did leave, is because I was appearing in another place which sometimes has jurisdiction equal, greater, it depends on who you ask and the matter, sir, than this one, and I was not here to greet Senator Nichols. Sir, I wish to publicly say, which might cause him more trouble, but that he is my friend, and we have known each other from UV days, where he was the individual who encouraged me to get involved in guild politics. So maybe any of the issues that we currently find ourselves with could be traced back to Senator Nichols. But I must say that I am gladdened in terms of personally having him here, and I believe that he will bring a strong and robust contribution to this honorable House, sir. Sir, the budget and the presentation which has been presented, I think, shows that the government is seeking as far as possible to make things work in most difficult circumstances. And sir, in this context, I plan to give my view on the proposals that have been put forward and to offer some small suggestions with regard to the various scenarios in a way and a hope of, as always, encouraging the dialogue. Firstly, sir, I think the concept of a shield, as stated, is one which we all know the reason for. And I think it shows the sophistication of the government in being able to capture the mind and mood of the populace with regard to the fact that we need a shield. Certainly in these times, sir, unprecedented as some would say all times are, the concept of taking protective mechanisms, it is understood, sir. And taking the protective mechanism which seeks to protect the less fortunate, is always an ideal for which we should strive for. In so doing, sir, we need to recognize that unless there is a certain appreciation for social responsibility, those who have to give to provide that protection may feel a bit hard done by, sir. So it is a bit of the balancing act which the government finds itself having to conduct. Anecdotally, sir, my observations are that the recent influx of the Barmy Army et al. Certainly has provided a much-needed shot in the arm for our tourism industry, and it should be commended with regard to the resulting knock-on effect. And why I say anecdotal, sir, is that I was able to get a report from a friend who has a small establishment that he was able to sell 4 cases of local brew within 17 minutes. So that's just an idea of the knock-on effect which these things can have. We have seen the videos coming out of Oistins. While they may have some negative aspects to what we see, we recognize that that itself is evidence of economic activity. So we have to continue to see how we can get the economic activity going, but do so in a manner which is safe. And with the new BA2 variant making the rounds, sir, hopefully we do not pay too heavy a price as we seek to find that balance, sir. We also hear positives with regard to the real estate market and its crystallization. I'm not too sure what that means, but it seems as though there are properties above a certain threshold which are starting to see movement based on interest. I believe also, sir, again, I have this in my anecdotal category, that because of the long-stay visitors, the Welcome Stamp initiative, there has been an increase in terms of utilization of certain type of properties. We have, however, sir, seen that if we ever drop our guard with regard to COVID, all those gains are quickly lost as we saw those persons leave the island when they were told by their respective nature to return from whence they came. So all in all, sir, on a purely observational level for myself, I see evidence of activity which I believe shows signs of an economy which is starting to breathe a bit. But we recognize that we cannot just rely on what we see or what we hear or what we feel, or so we say, sir. So we look at the metrics. And what do the metrics tell us in terms of the picture which is painted? We have GDP growth up to 1.4%, and coming from a negative 14, well, that has to be a positive, sir. We have inflation at 3.2% with a projection to push, so we keep our eye on that. We have unemployment down from 17.9 to 12.4. Some will say, well, you shouldn't feel good about 12.4 unemployment, but coming from 17.9, sir, I think you're entitled to feel good about it. Gross public sector debt is up at 136%, getting a bit tight in that regard, sir. And import cover, which I think we famously started to measure some time back, is at 40 weeks. That cover, however, is funded by borrowings. However, the borrowings are at very good rates. We recognize the cause and effect of that. Importantly, sir, our credit rating remains stable. And all things considered, I believe that these efforts, or the efforts which resulted in these things being the way they are, should be recognized and commended. So while we have these good and positive metrics, we therefore contrast them and lay them next to the following metrics, which then allow us to have perhaps a fuller picture. And I'm trying to keep it in a very layman-like term, because I am not too strong on finances, so I'm just speaking from my perspective as to what I see. In this regard, sir, the following metrics are the arrivals, which I believe that Senator Cummings, Minister Cummings would have laid out the reasons for and how they plan to build that back up, indicating the heavy hit that was done because of COVID, sir. We have a 1% primary deficit, which we have to fill, and of course the $600 million in taxes, which were lost because of COVID, and COVID expenses of some $390 million, sir. Recognizing, sir, and it was interesting to hear that the government knows that this is the scenario and is taking active steps to resolve the issues. And of course, it's not just about the metrics, but how we stay together as a society. I wouldn't take debate, sir. Now, in this regard, I believe that that is how we find ourselves with talk of a shield. So we recognize that we are in a position where the economy is starting to show some signs, but we do have some worrisome metrics which we have to be able to address. We have to protect the less fortunate amongst us, so therefore we have to create this concept of a shield. And it's stated under the shield of the government program was, of course, the expansion of the NIS, the BEST program with regard to the hotels. The question remains, and I'm looking forward, because I know Minister Cummings will hold them to the task, with the KPI performance, the returns of these initiatives, sir. So we heard Minister Monroe Knight speak about that as well, sir. So these investments which are being put forward, we will hopefully see the returns and a measurable metric with regard to the expenses which are being laid forward. And then, of course, sir, we have the household mitigation efforts which are being stepped. So this is the shield which is contemplated, and let's hope that it works. So, sir, I did a little exercise after all the metrics and what I observed, what I felt, to actually break the different policies, to break the different proposals which will be coming into separate categories. And I'm keeping it simple, sir. I call it a give and a take, sir. A caress and a clout, sir. Breaking it down, a horse and a carrot, sir. In terms of seeking to describe what the budget does, the different steps that they're taking, and how we can categorize them. Because at the end of the day, it's all about finding that balance. So, sir, under the take category, because you always start with the bad news and then let's go to the good. So we start with the take. We have the levy and the hot topic. The levy is not a tax. We have the levy on the commercial business of banks and insurance companies. This has generated rigorous debate back and forth. The aim is, for my part, that this not be passed on to consumers, and of course it must raise a question of whether or not it constitutes indirect taxation. Time will tell, and hopefully our esteemed agents at the BRA are able to keep vigilant tabs on what is being done. However, the government has set out the reason for this policy. The private sector needs to be able to work with the government and have that dialogue with regard to it moving forward. The banks can rightly say, well, we have had to take the write-down based on our bonds. The government can then rightly say, but you have made profit. The bank can say, well, hold on, this profit will, or this loss, or this levy, will impact on my members and my employees. And they will be reduced in what they have to take home and potential benefits. The government can say, well then, maybe you can look at a reduction in your shareholder dividends and put more towards your employees. This is the balance that has to be done. These are the conversations which we should be seeking to encourage. At the end of the day, I believe, Mr. President, it is about a commitment to Barbados. And if there is a scenario where the levy is viewed as unfair, how do we make these corporations and conglomerates comfortable with the fact that After this is done, things will hopefully be better, and we will recognize the effort that you have made in this regard. Just a commentary, sir, and I'm sure that the government will deal with it as necessary. Another issue, sir, this is in the, we're going to get to the positives, but we're dealing with the take segment first, sir, is of course the individual levy. Now, sir, my anecdotal inspiration and observation on certain platforms, which I should be careful to mention, shows that there is a concern of the younger professional class with regard of this 1% 1% personal levy for persons earning more than $6,250. I can say, sir, as a young professional, there was a time when the $62 that would come out of such a levy would impact. I recognize the counter-argument which persons made that that is nothing when you compare to what your expenses really are. However, there should be an active dialogue because the government has said we are listening to the youth. There should be an active dialogue when the same youth say that this levy is going to impact me. So how are we going to explain, well, we're doing this for this purpose. Maybe in 5 years down the road, you will get the benefit of what we are sacrificing. Sir, at this stage, I will age myself and say that when I started working under I believe it was the ONR for government, sir, there were tremendous avenues available for investment. Mutual funds, credit unions, sir, new stocks, a variety of registered retirement saving plans, sir, a variety of ways where you can put your salary every month with regard to tax benefit. That has been decreased over the years for a variety of reasons. So I think we need to be a bit conscious of the young professional who has a question with regard to the individual levy and see how we can work with them to give them comfort that in the tax, there may be a way to get back some of what you lost. And even if you don't get it back, you understand why you're being asked to pay for this social responsibility price to preserve our country. Maybe it's just the simple reality. One time, sir, I'm going to segue here. I was in Jamaica and Bounty Killer was performing. Bounty Killer, sir, is a reggae artist, dancehall artist.
I'm well
You would
familiar.
know? You would know, sir.
I'm well familiar, Senator Voice.
And it was an uptown session, sir. Thankfully, hopefully, we don't get there in terms of having such a clear distinction. But at the uptown session, sir, Bounty Killer was talking, he was performing, and he stopped in the middle of his presentation. And he told the crowd, you have to understand what I'm saying. And of course, he said it in patois, which I wouldn't try to imitate. He says, if a man doesn't have food in his yard, he's coming in your yard. So you have an interest in ensuring that your society and the threads which bind and hold it together are preserved. So when we speak about having to make a contribution and why, we must recognize that it will be hard for certain persons, and we have to explain to them why their sacrifice is worth it. But at the end of the day, sir, we're human beings, so hopefully there is something that we can do for these individuals in the future. Along with the levy, sir, there is also the increase in contributions to NIS. This is going to further reduce disposable income. That's a fact. May not be significant, but every one drop that's filled bucket, I think, I'm not sure you correct you for that, but anyway, it adds up, sir. It adds up. Under the take section, sir, we have the alternate fuel levy. So those with electronic vehicles will have some concerns. I believe they have been raised in terms of how it's going to be calculated. I heard an operator of the vehicles indicate a possible solution for how that is to be done. And then we have the change with regard to new public servants having to fund their own pensions. Now, of course, Senator Nichols is chomping at the bit to explain that these are new persons who would be able to put their house in order before they get into the affairs, and maybe being more vigilant and planning your own pension is the better way to go. but we, of course, understand the cultural and historic importance of pensions and public service, and the fact that it is a sacrifice in terms of certain goals with regard to employment salary exponential increases, but you're given stability and pension and security of tenure. So what impact would that have in terms of new persons coming in, sir? Under take, sir, and I know it sounds long, but it's not really that long. Under take, sir, we have the sweet drink tax, and this, of course, is stated for a good reason. And I wish, sir, to publicly apologize to Senator Haynes. Because, sir, in 2018, Senator Haynes came to us in the chamber and said, stop eating macaroni pie and sauce and sweet drinks, and I believe Senator Maynard and Nurse booed her, sir. I wasn't part, but I was, I think the response was boo. But it was an appreciation. Senator Haynes was ahead of the curve, and she was saying, we need to be mindful of this type of stuff. So Senator Haynes, please accept our apology for not recognizing that we need to have some moderation. Along with the moderation, Mr. President, the government says that we can use this to increase our revenue. It can also send a message with NCDs. We understand that falls within the take section. Then, of course, there's the increase in the national gas rates, which will have a return of an increase in the cost of the food, which is prepared by the restaurants because they normally utilize natural gas on the coast with regard to their cooking, and the individual houses which do that. So that's the take section, sir. There are some measures which we are yet to see the impact. Particularly worrisome is the levy on both the professionals and the company in relation to the insurance and the banks. But you know what, sir? Things have a way of working themselves out. So let's see what happens. Under the give, sir, I want to commend the government for the land tax release and relief, sir, in relation to moving the threshold to $300,000. Y'all should be happy about that. I have sat down in the chamber and indicated one of the few avenues for an individual who has no capital to start the exercise is by seeking to own a piece of property. I have indicated previously, sir, that the land tax currently is almost punitive and almost sends a message to you like, how dare you try to change your means? This, I think, is a tremendous step in the right direction, sir. It was a promise made during the campaign, sir. You know, you're listening, independently listening to the promise that was made, and the promise has been clearly implemented, sir. Now, sir, I would offer one caveat. This is a reevaluation year. So the value that you feel your property has, I'm sorry, Senator, I'm sorry. The value that your property currently has for 2022 may have a different value in 22, 23, but I am going to take it at face value, and I'm commending the government for this maneuver. Sir, under the give section, the water rate decrease for farmers, excellent move. I've reached out to one or two who I know personally, and it is expected to have, hopefully, a knock-on decrease in agricultural production costs. Public officer loan for electronic vehicles should spur the market on and give the public officers a much-needed give, sir. And that is something which, with the environment and everything considered, I believe will be hastily accepted. It was a bit unclear whether the loan applied for strictly electronic or hybrid, but I believe that will be explained in the necessary responses. Sir, the removal of VAT on personal critical care items, I mean, that is a tremendous gesture, should be applauded, and is practical. Again, we have noted Senator Haynes' effort with regard to the Pink Lady Project or Lady Box Project, and these are the things which shows that the government is aware that where they can help, they will. But that comes with an understanding of the trade-off. If I am saying that I am providing sanitary care, I need to have persons appreciate the argument as to why. And that's where the education comes in with regard to the messaging. And that's why the dialogue is so important. You'll keep it, that's my theme for this session, sir, dialogue, sir. Now, so there's some, and that is in the give category, 5 items, and there's some which I've put within the middle because I've not really understood as to where they will fall, but I believe let's call them stabilization measures. Under the stabilization measures, sir, we have the gas being capped at $3.99. Now, the fact is, sir, the year opened at oil at $76 a barrel, and now it's at $123. At a time, sir, the same youth in Barbados were planning to protest the $3.99, but now all of a sudden the $3.99 looks very good. Perspective, sir. Perspective. Another stabilization measure, sir, is the custom duty on containers and the restriction of capping that fee with regard to the import on the full container price. This hopefully would lead to a resulting stabilizing of import costs, and it is hoped that those savings will be passed on even as a temporary measure. So I put those within the stabilization segment, sir. So, sir, in terms of the give and take, I will say that it's a balanced-up approach. The take, however, while balanced, is disproportionately on those who can give more. And while that is equitable, we need to be careful that we get them on board as to why they're being asked to give so much. There's only so much give that a person has, sir. There's only so much give. I think all of us as husbands know that, but the point is that, you have to balance how much you are pushing. So, sir, I would say that the balance is clear, and we hope that the shield works because we all benefit if it does. So when we look at the measures now, we say, okay, this is where that money is going, this is where that money is coming. So let's talk about growth then, the highlights. The other steps, the other big ticket items that the government has identified will get things moving. Digitization. I think this is a great idea. But the proof of the pudding with regard to digitization, sir, is implementation. Knock-on steps. The government just publicly announced there was the ransomware issue. If you're going digitization, you need to have the resources for the resultant securing of digitization. And it is hard for even a private sector entity to go forth on this project, so the government has to be wish luck on this endeavor because it will result in benefit. Of course, the government is also mindful of the various data protection obligations that will incur as a result of this. Security, access, retooling of workers to be able to utilize this process, additional costs with regard to implementing it. Maybe that's an avenue for growth. Maybe that's considered a capital work expenditure. I do not know, sir. It's a good goal. Implementation is going to be licked, sir, practically. And I say that because I've been there. Sir, cryptocurrency is a bad word in certain segments, or was a bad word in certain segments, but the world is starting to come around to it. The government is putting itself at the vanguard by saying that they're entering into an arrangement with Binance. If it works, it will work very well depending on how the market is regulated. And we've seen that the US has taken the step, well, if you can't beat them, join them. However, banks and cryptocurrencies still have a bit of negotiating to do before they are accepted. It's still a practical issue, sir, with regard to its utilization as a security. It's still a practical issue with regard to domesticating the returns of your cryptocurrency gains. It's still a practical issue with regard to access. Why is it that the cryptocurrency company that was in Barbados went the path that it did? The answer the government is aware of. So how do we solve that problem going forward if we say that we're serious about cryptocurrency? There are pros, there are cons, digital dollar, everybody's on it. We must be aware of utilization, uptake, but it has a tremendous benefit with regard to doing business and everyone walking around with these. It's a start, implementation, regulation, and correspondent bank concerns. The same banks that we have an issue with, we would be needing to work with them, sir. Building of 10K homes, a beautiful measure. I can see it only as an upside. I hope it's done. I hope the environmental roofs are put on. I hope local contractors get the jobs. I hope local skilled craftsmen get the jobs in terms of the implementation of the different works. And let's see what comes out of it. Sounds like a win-win, sir. Question is, what would actually be done? And being a lawyer, what do you mean by home? So if I have a structure, which is a tower with 10 flats, that's 10 homes. Or do I mean 10 standalone buildings, sir? Just an interesting semantic, which might come up as to what you say when you have the 10,000. And I wish the minister, because he's been publicly put on the spot with regard to getting it done, sir. And I wish him all the best. Sir, there was mention of other major capital work projects. Some we can trace back to a bit of days past, but let's see where we could get off the ground. The issue is that when in 2022, there are certain names that you recognize from 2018 or pre-2018, we have to say, when will that come to pass? But again, let's get the capital works done. And I also understand that there's capital works intended with regard to the roads and with regard to the nation building, which should lead to the increased employment and then knock-on effect. I've seen the debushing program. It has its pros. There's some minor cons, which I'll speak at another time. And I wish the government the best. And please, let's allocate more money for signage for those when they're working on the side of the road so that persons are aware that they're doing the work and they are protected with the relevant safety equipment, notices, and materials, sir. Sir, I'm a big fan of the historic slave trade record, digital project, the archival economy, as was stated. And for a variety of reasons, I enthusiastically support this project. The question is, of course, the costing. The question is, of course, the implementation, but I believe it's a project which will rebound to the benefit of this country and even the region, and ties in naturally with our tourism heritage product. The public green energy projects, again, very excited, but we must recognize that there's a certain loss in investor confidence with these bonds, and we have to make sure, by whatever guarantee mechanism that we can find, that we encourage the investment, because we want our people to be invested with the government, and I think that is a good idea. Ease of doing business push, that will have the results. It's not easy. It is not easy. And the government has a long road in getting us where they want us to be, but they should be encouraged. So, perhaps the solution. I was listening to a thought experiment where they were describing efforts with regard to increase production and performance. And they used the example of a school. And they said that when they looked at it first, they thought that the problem was there weren't enough teachers. So they added more teachers to the school, hoping that that would then help the children learn. When they measured the results of adding the teachers and increasing the staff, they didn't realize any noticeable difference. It's only from subsequent experimenting and noting that they found out the reason the children weren't improving was because the children were hungry. The reason I say that, sir, is that sometimes money is viewed as the solution. When we speak to certain ideas of implementation, digitization, ease of doing business, we might want to take the time to examine what is the true root cause, sir. And after we have done that examination, we will then know what the appropriate step is. Sir, the budget is balanced. It gives, but it does take. It takes a bit more from some, and we have to find a way to get them in the dialogue and understand why it's being done. And there's a narrative which has always bothered me when I came back to Barbados. And that was a narrative where persons who benefit from the free education and the mostly free education and the different social services which have allowed a certain growth within the social and economic class are somewhat reticent when it's time to give back. And it's an understanding based on their own reality and their own perspective. Hopefully the civics discourse that was mentioned by Senator Monroe Knight would assist persons in understanding why the give is being asked. And I think that is important, sir. Let us let persons know why the give is being asked, and we move forward as we seek to get the economy going, and the government has the support and has my support in this regard. I thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Senator Kevin Boyce. Additional speaker, next. Senator Gregory Nichols.
Mr. President, I'm indeed very grateful to contribute to the debate on the appropriation bill before the Senate. When this debate began in this place on Friday, you would appreciate that I had only a cursory interest in the contributions as a civic-minded citizen, also as a loyal member of the Barbados Labour Party, to see my younger colleagues performing in their parliamentary role. And sir, life brings with it challenges and opportunities. And I am going to place on the record at the outset of my presentation my gratitude to the Prime Minister, who has been a constant in terms of my own political career and development, for giving me this opportunity again. And I say again because, Mr. President, you will recall that in 2003, barely out of law school, having only one by-election in St. Thomas behind me, the Prime Minister, who was then the General Secretary of the party, tasked me with the responsibility of being the chairman of the Northern Zone. And I met with her, then Prime Minister Arthur, in an office in this building, and went there with the intention to decline the opportunity. But Ms. Motley indicated that you cannot say no to a Prime Minister. Perhaps that was then a precursor for a discussion that we had over this weekend. So that I want to formally place on the record, because a lot of people who know me would say Prime Minister Arthur picked me for the Senate in 2003, some 19 years ago. But it was indeed Ms. Motley who gave me the opportunity for Prime Minister Arthur to see me in a different role. And I remain grateful for that opportunity. Sir, when we look at the appropriations bill, and it is always important to place things in their proper context, because we have had a difficult 2 years as a country. When the government came to office in 2018, we had perilous economic circumstances to deal with. And a lot of the sectors that we depend on for a living in this country face uncertainties. We were not being able to deliver on certain basic physical and social amenities across the country. And that having to grapple with what the government termed its mission-critical policies. We then had the outset of the COVID-19 pandemic in the middle of 2020, going into a second year, deepening and strengthening its grip on countries across the world. we had now started to deal with the IMF program, Barbados Economic Recovery Transformation Program, and we're seeing results. We had the effect of a freak storm, and that brought to our attention, Mr. President, that what we call the hurricane season had not yet started, but a freak storm could cause so much devastation across Barbados with widespread flooding. Magnifying what we understand and what Madam Deputy President would understand and tell you is our vulnerability as a small island developing state to climate change and environmental catastrophes. After 30, 40 years, the volcano erupted again in St. Vincent and affected us, delayed the progress that we thought that we had had by coming out of COVID, only to hear by the end of last year, another strain of COVID has come. And is it important, Mr. Speaker, to place this appropriation bill within that context? Because many in Barbados will give you the impression that we are out of the woods and that we are now in a land of milk and honey and all is well, and that the government is being difficult and unreasonable in some of the measures prescribed by the Prime Minister and Minister of Finance in the budget last week. I want, Mr. President, to phrase my contribution within the context of the Good Society. The Good Society is, to my mind, the place where we should aspire as a nation. We must always strive to be a good society. There are certain fundamental elements of the good society, whether you are in government or in opposition, but if you are actively engaged in the process of nation building, it should always be at the forefront of your policy perspective, Mr. President. And it is not something that can be defined at one point in time or something that can be defined in one place. But we understand a good society must start with a basic appreciation of democratic governance. It must have a respect for the rule of law. It must operate on the basis of organized government with the separation of powers between the co-equal branches of government. It must protect fundamental rights of all citizens across all classes, creeds, and perspectives. It must give effect to basic economic rights too. Education, health, a property owning democracy, Mr. President, and basic principles of fairness and equity. These are all parts of what I consider to be hallmarks of a good society. And Mr. President, when I examine this appropriation bill and what is intended, I measure it against the concept of how we are building a good society. And Mr. President, you and Madam Deputy President will be familiar with a test of public policy. When I first came into the parliamentary party, I learned that you measure public policy on a number of bases: certainty of incidence, the target or focus group that you want to effect some change or benefit for them must derive those benefits without any red tape or any confusion or any long period or lag between the imposition of the policy and real effects. Clarity of purpose. Public policy must be clear in its intent, and the targets must know that they can benefit from this policy when it is announced. It must be also cost-effective, Mr. President. because it cannot replace something and create now a more cumbersome mechanism to administer it, a more expensive mechanism to administer it. And last but not least is the test of reasonableness. So that when we look at the appropriation bill before this Senate, and we apply what I consider to be those erstwhile lessons in the tests for public policy: certainty of incidence, clarity of purpose, cost effectiveness, and reasonableness, I would take the criticism of government's economic program and agenda within the political context from which those criticisms have arisen. Mr. President, none of the economic problems that we face in Barbados are new. For hundreds of years, from the time the discipline of the study of economics came around, economists all over the world, Mr. President, were looking at the eradication of poverty. They were looking at inflation. They were looking at policies and programs to raise the rate of growth in the economy. Economists have looked at trade policy and how do you expand your economic outreach, whether it is through navigation of the seas, whether it is through conquest of other territories, so that the economic problems that we as a society face are not new. But what history teaches us, that there are certain ways in which countries grapple with these changes, and there can be fundamental differences in approaches. They can have a Keynesian or Friedman type approach, a market-based or more structured central-based economy type. So that what we grapple with as a small island developing state, Mr. President, should not be contextualized in a setting that places a burden, say, on government to solve this problem now, once and for all. Because economic challenges in a society as we develop, as we live, are not new. So therefore, when we examine some of the taxation in the budget, we hear the outcry. But Mr. President, the pandemic is not over. And anybody who believes that the government should not put in a system to manage this pandemic over the next year, those people will be criticizing the government when the strain that is now causing lockdowns in China, South Korea, and Japan moves across the world. And then, with the children back in schools, we have to look for new isolation facilities or to open back those isolation facilities. And Senator Dr. Maynard today indicated that these facilities are costly. So that the UN cry about taxing banks and insurance companies and people who earn a certain amount of money for this one-off tax. I measure it, sir, against the tests of clarity of purpose, certainty of incidence, cost effectiveness, and reasonableness. And then when I look at what the government has had to do and what the challenges that we may face on the horizon may appear to be, then I have to accept the criticism of various interests in the society as they will normally arise from time to time when governments impose taxes. And I hear my colleague, Senator Boyce. I hear him loud and clear. But, Mr. President, I want to assure the Barbadian public that the government's responsibility to navigate throughout these COVID times has not ended, and the government is not asleep, Mr. President. Mr. President, I want to address a few issues about governance and democracy within the context of the good society. We all believe in free and fair elections, Mr. President, as a people, and honoring the results of an election is as important as having a free and fair election. To my mind, that is high on the ranking of a good society. A society that does not have free and fair elections, or that does not honor the results of the electorate, is not a good society, or is not striving to be a good society. The voix populi, voix Dei, voice of the people, is the voice of God. And sir, that 18th century concept arises as a result of people understanding that there is no natural or divine law that determines how people should organize themselves in a society. So therefore, and that no one person has any particular divine or natural right to rule over others. So therefore, the voix populi becomes the voix Dei, voice of God, in a sense that the respect for leadership must also concomitantly give rise to respect of the voice of the people. We have a unique situation here in this country. The second time the electorate of Barbados has voted in its elections for all of the seats in the House of Assembly to come to one particular party. And there has been various discussions and debates over the last 2 or 3 years about this. But I want to say, and particularly to my good friend, Senator Boyce, who may have been trying to intrigue me into discussing other things by referring to me to matters that he knows are outside of my pay grade. But I will refer to some comments that I believe he's made in this chamber, and to bring some semblance of balance to the notion that the separation of powers is a very important aspect of our democracy in a good society. And not only the separation between the co-equal branches of government, but even within a particular branch, there is inter-branch separation that must be honored. So that in the legislature, there are 2 houses. But one is elected, and one is appointed based on the results of the election and also with the historical appointment of independent senators to bring balance to the discussion. I want to suggest, through you, Mr. President, that they revisit this notion that in a democracy, the government is required to consult with opposition senators in the development of policy. I've heard that, and it sounded strange to me immediately and instinctively, this notion that the government is required in a democracy to consult with independent senators raised eyebrows to me because, first of all, the government doesn't even have to consult with the opposition to develop policy. The government is accountable to the people. And in a good society where there are free and fair and regular elections, and those election results are honored, this parliament for several years has operated on the basis, let the opposition have its say, and the government has its way. That is the basis of our Westminster democracy, that we have worked so well, even in times when people like you and I, Mr. President, could not be in here. It has always been that the opposition has its say, but the government has its way. But the opposition cannot demand that the government consults with it before it brings matters to the House, because there is a separation between the executive arm of government and the legislative arm. So when I'm hearing a branch or a part of the legislative branch requiring the executive to consult with it before the executive can bring to Parliament policy and legislation and bills, is absurd, unprecedented, and strange. And we must not get too fanciful, because, you know, one of the things I must also say that the notion of government consulting with the independent senators is strange also, because that means that they are no longer independent. Because independents do not operate en bloc. And government must not treat two independents or independent senators as if they were one coherent bloc, because they will lose, in essence, their independence.
Sorry, sir, just on a point of order, and I believe that my friend and I have had issues where we were sent out from another place by a judge, sir, but under the rules of debate, can my friend direct himself to the actual debate at hand, sir, as in what the House is discussing with regard to the budgetary proposal, sir? I'm still trying to see the linkage.
I'm not understanding you. Just
Oh, sorry, Dima, sorry. I was saying I was noting with interest my friend's latest treatise, sir, with regard to the law or parliamentary practice, but I believe that we're debating the bill with regard to the government allocation of resources. And if he could direct to how that is what we are discussing right now, where he is, sir, I will be most grateful. And that's under the standing order, sir, the rules of debate with regard to the topic at hand, sir.
yes, the appropriation bill is one of those bills which perhaps gives the widest scope for debate, in that the appropriation bill deals with all expenditure across all heads, which would include governance, it includes the Electoral and Boundaries Commission, it includes allocations to President, Cabinet Office, it includes all matters. And remember the difference with the way that the Senate standing orders are written. There's one speech. So a senator does his second reading, or what would be in the House considered second reading speeches, policy and vision and high-level policy, as well as a deep dive into specific heads. So some senators may choose to look specifically at programs and expenditure. Others may look at high policy, vision for the society, where we should be as opposed to where we are. So there's a lot more scope in an appropriations bill debate than there is in any other debate. So the contribution is indeed relevant and meets the standing order on relevance. Continue, Senator Nichols.
I'm obliged to you, Mr. President. So that, Mr. President, the concept of, and I was making the point, that the government must consult with the independent senators is problematic from the point of view that you have one branch of the legislature requiring the executive to consult with it before the executive's business is brought to the legislature. And the second problem I have with it is it assumes that the independents are en bloc. And that is not the intention of the framers of our democratic system. It is unprecedented. I know no notion of it in any of the Commonwealth territories that practice any variant of the Westminster model. And Mr. President, I don't want to sound alarmist, but the Constitution of Barbados makes provision for bills to be passed in the House of Assembly, and if rejected by the Senate, to come back to the House and go for assent if they are rejected by the Senate a second time. We are running the risk of those safeguards, those guardrails in the constitutions being operationalized in a context where the government finds that its legislative agenda is being frustrated.
Mr. President, I rise on a point of order. Specifically, scope of debate under Section 35, debate under any motion, bill, or amendment shall be relevant to such motion, bill, or amendments. There has been no contention, as my friend is raising, my very good friend, of any form of objection or collusion or any form of conversation that he's referencing at this debate. What is the relevance to the debate at hand under Section 35? I have heard you, Mr. President, with regard to the wide range, but I think that's a conversation that my friend is almost being, I believe the term is previous, Mr. President. So I am making a point, sorry sir, officially, I'm rising under that my friend is in breach of Section 35 scope of debate in relation to the debate we have heard here today, sir.
And my previous ruling stands. The scope of debate does not depend on responding to what anyone has said. All senators are able to speak pretty much in this appropriation bill on a wide range of aspects of government and governance, because they're all stretched to its proper application, stretch across the full range of the operations of government. And he's speaking about elections and their consequences, and so far he's within the four walls of the wide range of the appropriation bills, which is all of government debate. And like I said, in the Senate, there's just this one slice of time. So if you think he's using this time for esoteric or philosophical jurisprudential matters, that is his choice. He therefore would not have time to deal with bread and butter issues. But then again, that's his choice. Another senator may deal with all bread and butter issues, none of the good society, philosophical discussion. But he's within the rules so far.
Mr. President, I'm guiding as to your interpretation of Standing Order 35, sir.
In another debate, which is more narrowly struck, then that may be another matter. But this one gives full range.
I am guided, Mr. President.
You're not good,
I'm obliged, Mr. President. I think when we read the record of the debate, Senator Boyce will recall that he did indicate today that he expects government to consult with the independent senators on matters, and he said that today in this debate. And on a sober reflection, after he has, as the young people say, stop feeling himself, he will recognize that I'm responding to a particular point he made in the debate about the need to consult with independent senators. I'm just pointing out that government caucusing with independent senators as a bloc deprives that, the notion of independent senators therefore goes out of the window. Now, I have spent a considerable length of time as a practicing attorney at law, Mr. President, in the sphere of labor law. And it would almost be remiss of me if I were not to speak to the broader aspects of what I feel are some troubling issues and signs on the dark clouds on the horizon as government in its allocation to the Ministry of Labor and the Social Partnership and third sector. The pandemic has had a significant effect on labor. And you get the feeling, Mr. President, that employers have taken advantage of the pandemic. Businesses have shed workers at an alarming rate. And as economic activity has returned to the country, the employment is not coming back with the same rate in which it went. I believe, Mr. President, that the pandemic has shown that the resources that we allocate to the Employment Rights Tribunal are not as adequate as they should be. This is not to say that there's a deliberate plan to underfund it, but it is within the context of what we have seen in the pandemic. Certainly, the tribunal does not have the capacity in a timely fashion to deal with all of the matters that are brought before it. In fact, we have no passed legislation to deal with sexual harassment. So apart from the hardcore employment issues of dismissal and things of that sort, and not having sufficient notice on termination, the tribunal has other matters to deal with, not only discrimination, harassment, but also even discrimination in employment. I would like to see the Employment Rights Tribunal strengthen its capacity. It should have its own home and not have to wait until the other government departments at Warren's, that use the Warren's office building, are not having a meeting in that room and so forth. I believe that we need to move to a stage, Mr. President, where that tribunal is a full-time tribunal. Not necessarily functioning like a court, but we must respect that it, in all respects, is a court. It makes awards in the thousands of dollars. Only last week an award was made of over $300,000 by the tribunal. Their decisions are appealed to the Court of Appeal and then on to the Caribbean Court of Justice. So they function as a court. And I believe that working people and employers too should have some certainty in the resolution of their disputes. The tribunal, to my mind, Mr. President, needs to have some institutional teeth to enforce its judgments and its awards. Because we have employers in Barbados, Mr. President, particularly those employers in the construction sector, that do not honor the awards of the Employment Rights Tribunal. And there is no enforcement mechanism to enforce the awards made by the tribunal. In fact, in the most recent decision of the tribunal, the employer did not even show up. And what government should do, in my respectful submission, and Mr. President, I will honestly make myself available to Madam Leader and to Minister of Labor to discuss a framework where government has to now redress that issue. Because if employers feel that they don't have to appear before the tribunal at all, make no appearance, file no documents, send no witnesses, make no submissions, and when judgment is given, then they laugh, and then the legislation has no ability to compel the performance of the award made by the tribunal, then government needs to address it. And perhaps we need to look at making it a requirement for businesses who get work from government, get contracts from government, to satisfy that they have no pending or outstanding awards that are unsatisfied that have been delivered by the tribunal. And I feel that that would make a lot of the construction companies in Barbados that are taking advantage of workers come to what my grandmother called a Christian understanding. We also have external companies which own villas in Barbados. And butlers, maids, gardeners, and the like find themselves unable to start proceedings before the tribunal because there is no requirement under all laws for the external company to have a locum tenens or an agent present on the ground to accept service of documents. They only need a registered office to file corporate tax returns and annual returns under the Companies Act and the various corporate legislation for tax and regulatory purposes, but they're not required to have a person to accept service. And I'm talking about the external companies that own a lot of the villas on the island. Workers in these facilities are suffering as a result of their inability to start proceedings before the Employment Rights Tribunal. And I therefore think it is time for us to look at these things as well. Because a good society, Mr. President, is based on the principle of fairness. A good society is based on the rule of law. While we welcome the investment into the villa development section of the Barbadian economy, and we understand its importance to government's tax revenue in terms of land taxes, corporation taxes, payroll expenses, and so forth, there cannot be a place where workers feel they are left behind. Government must step in the good society to deal with these breaches, so that it is almost 10 years since the passage of the Employment Rights Act. It's time to review. It is time for the stakeholders, the Ministry of Labor, the employers, the unions, and the practitioners in the sector, including attorneys at law and human resource professionals. Because we don't want a situation where Barbados becomes a place where workers' rights are not respected. We don't want that reputation, Mr. President. We will not be a good society in that regard. I could not come here, Mr. President, and not speak to a number of recent situations in which, even in the public sector, workers' representatives were disrespected, particularly by the last administration, Mr. President. And we take these things for granted. But we must look at them earnestly to ensure that they never happen again. Only last week, Mr. President, the High Court of Barbados struck down a piece of legislation 40 years old. The prison officers brought in 2016 a case to challenge the constitutionality of the 1982 Prison Amendments Act, passed by a former Barbados Labour Party administration, Mr. President, to establish the Prison Officers Association. But at the same time, it said that they could not be members of a trade union, and the most draconian measures to prevent them from associating with a trade union, accepting economic benefits from a trade union, or any consultations with a trade union were now outlawed, with penalties including heavy fines, loss of pension in the public sector, and things of that like. And that amendment, Mr. President, was passed in 1982 without any alteration of the Constitution in manner prescribed by Section 49. It is not sexy news, Mr. President, because there was another case last week that took the attention of the press and everyone else. But here it was that for 40 years, the prison officers will tell you that they, within the public sector, and successive governments have come and gone, and that their cries have not been answered. And it took almost 6 years for the court system to deliver what, in my mind, is a fairly straightforward decision. We had, in the recent past, the over 60s at the BIDC, who are mercifully saved by this government, not contesting a judgment that went in the favor of those workers. And I'm talking about people who are secretaries and administrative officers who were all sent home one day in an arbitrary fashion and had to fight for years through the court system. An arbitrary decision struck down by the court that has cost the taxpayers of Barbados, which this government has had to fund in these estimates, over $2 million. You have had, in 2016 and 2017, both major teachers' unions, the Barbados Union of Teachers and the Barbados Secondary Teachers Union, having union meetings that they have had for many years, and the perniciousness of the last administration of docking teachers' pay who attended union meetings. You fought the matter through the court, but the court system, as slow as it was then, yielded a result in favor of those teachers without due process. We cannot be a good society if these things happen. And we have to bring attention to these irritants to the good society when they arise, so that vigilance is the only protection of the good society and a democracy. Mr. President, we had the terms leave with pay that teachers, when you started, sir, your journey, sir, in your professional life, you started as a teacher, and you knew that after 15 years, you were entitled to a terms leave with pay. And then for every, I think it was every 3 years, or every 5 years, every 15 terms, right, every 5 years, you were entitled to another terms leave with pay. The last administration took that away. There was no consultation about it. There was no hue and cry in the society about it either. And when I sit from my other place as an attorney, and I see these things, and I see what bothers the Barbadian body politic on the calling programs and things of that nature. As a parent, I understand the tremendous stresses that the teaching community undergo. All parents can see it, particularly during the pandemic, with the teachers having to teach from home. And if you think an attentive child in a classroom, I said to the boys and I were not always good students. But imagine, sir, having to deal with a child who is distracted with the other things going wrong at home. We have to treat and continue to treat the people who teach our children with that respect, with that humaneness that is part of the good society. And this administration has put things in place to ensure that these benefits are restored. And it is in these estimates. And the government has to be praised, because if you have all of the benefits of the teaching profession being whittled away and dishonored without consultation, and you know what? From my perspective, when you had an overburdened court system with only 6 judges, 2 in the High Court doing criminal trials, family matters, commercial matters, and stuff like that, the constitutional matters and these things fell by the wayside. So it takes you 7 years to adjudicate what in other Commonwealth Caribbean jurisdictions takes 2 and 3 months. The government now has to put in its estimates to pay back teachers whose salaries were docked in 2016 and 2017 in these estimates. These estimates contain, Mr. President, payments for education officers who were superseded with the government regrading in 2003, 2004. And then they realized that they were supervising the education sector. But they were going to schools where principals were telling them that we are now ranked higher in service than you. We are listening to you. The chief education officer and the deputies cannot supervise all of the school plants in Barbados. The government put a mechanism in place to pay these persons who were affected by the regrading a pensionable allowance, which the last administration refused to pay, Mr. President. This government has had to put in the estimates, payments going back from 2006 and 7, which ought to have been paid. Where a head of the civil service, Mr. President, could inquire why are these people not being paid and nothing being done about it. This is what these estimates contain. We cannot be part of a good society. One, if we do not honor the traditions that ennoble the honorable teaching profession. We cannot be a good society, Mr. President, if we do nothing to protect the rights that have been gained by that noble profession. And certainly when we are rectifying the wrongs that have been done to the teaching profession, we need to say and commit ourselves never again. Mr. President, one of the things that is very dear to me is the sport of cricket. And if I speak about cricket during my time here, Mr. President, I do not want the other sports governing bodies to feel left out. This government has in place policies to address the development of sport. In yesterday's paper, I saw people making light statements of government's intention to build mini stadia across Barbados. All I would say, sir, is that the government is aware. And the Barbados Labour Party, Mr. President, has long been aware of the importance of sport. You, sir, were a former minister of sport. We have now witnessed the conclusion of a test match at which over 10,000 British fans have come to this country, not only for the test match here in March, but for the 5 T20 internationals in January. Mr. President, it's impossible to get a restaurant booking in Barbados. Cannot get a rental car. Gas stations, Mr. President, are filled with lines of tourists buying the ordinary things that Barbadians will buy. These are the restaurants that were closed during COVID, Mr. President. These are the hired car companies that had to close down. Some of them had to give back the cars to the finance companies that when you drive past us, of course, all you've seen is cars and cars that were in active economic activity. Mr. President, in 2024, West Indies will host the World Cup in the T20, the ICC T20 World Cup. I sincerely hope, and I'm putting Madam Leader of Government Business on early notice, because she knows that I have constantly been in her ears about this World Cup. Sorry, this cricketing events that we've had over the last 3 months. That Barbados puts in a solid bid to host the 2024 ICC Men's T20 final. We have had so far, Mr. President, since the stadium was rebuilt at Kensington Oval, 3 World Cup finals of ICC tournaments. We had the World Cup 50 over in 2007, and in 2010 we had the Women's and Men's T20 International final at Kensington Oval. We have the capacity to host beyond that of many other Caribbean countries and our neighbors. We have certain competitive advantages in terms of the rooms, and we have the hotels, we have the restaurants, we have the infrastructure. And the truth is that people like Barbados. This afternoon at Coco Cabana Beach, there is an an international charity raising funds. And during the course of this week, they will be giving to primary schools in Barbados 500 pairs of pads, 500 pairs of gloves, and 500 bats. They're raising money all over the world. They were in Antigua last week, they're in Grenada now. And they have been rolling out this program over the last 2 years in Barbados. I want to remind you, Mr. President, we have a legacy in cricket. It is cricket that makes Barbados known in the world. This Australian who is in charge of this charity came here, saw Brian Lara score 153 in 1999, fell in love with Barbados, and she's all around the world raising charity for cricket gear to be distributed in primary schools in Barbados. So that this love-hate relationship that we like to play with cricket, and by extension all other sports, has stopped. The government has recognized it. That is why the Prime Minister has said, we are going to make a cricketing industry. And I don't have to tell you, Mr. President, you imagine, and you would know how many schools in England and Ireland, the Honorable Leader of Government Business in the Senate will tell you, looking to come to Barbados next year, when COVID is lifted. These things are important in the development of the good society. But this is something that we are good at, internationally around the world. And therefore, we must stop being diffident when it comes to the development of sport. What we should be doing, Mr. President, is rolling out a framework where we can go into the hinterlands in Barbados and building out spaces where you see oystins. Everybody can't go to oystins. We need to have more spaces like Worthing Square that we could accommodate visitors to take the true, authentic Barbadian culinary experience. These are the attractions that bring people to Barbados. And cricket provides that experience. When we were last in government, the Ministry of Tourism and Sport, at the time, the Ministries of Tourism and the Ministry of Sport, we had a Formula 3 car came across the highway and the whole of Barbados was watching. Barbados is an active motorsport country. The government has in its plans to develop the jockey production career pathways, because we have produced some of the best jockeys in the world, so that when people try to pour cold water over the Prime Minister's vision for developing the sporting industry, and even more particularly the industry of cricket, you need to understand better what is currently going on now, how we can tap into that, build out the framework for other sports. When we tap into the reform of the education system, how do we get more young people active? I know Senator Haynes would agree with me. Too many young people in our school system are inactive, play no sport. Everybody is not going to be a Jason Hole and a Craig Braffett and a Joffa Archer, or Zane Maloney, or Patrick Husbands, or Rico Walcott. But we have to get more active, and we have to insist that young people get more active. And it means, Mr. President, that the education sector has to be more facilitative of teachers who teach math and English and science and so forth, going and become qualified in sporting disciplines so they can enhance the coaching deliverables to young people in Barbados and be compensated for it too. Because what you will pay for the development of teachers in co-curricular activities like sport, 10, 15 years down the road, Mr. President, you will save in what you pay to deal with the backing of the non-communicable diseases that have been long affecting our people, because you will have a profile of people across the country that are fitter, stronger, more athletically minded, and willing to compete and enhance their performances and also strive to get into international competitions and the like. These are things, Mr. President, that we as a good society have to do. We have to build up the foundation, yes, in education and in health, and make sure we can take care of our people. We have to understand what they call sexy in terms of the new age economy, crypto and those kinds of things, and the digital economy and that kind of stuff. But I will tell you, can't beat sport, Mr. President. The cricketers who play cricket for the West Indies earn in the top income earning profiles of all young people in the Caribbean over every profession. Mr. President, there are cricket clubs in Barbados that get $100,000 from the IPL in India as player production fees, as a commitment to development of the grassroots institutions that produce those cricketers. We've got to be serious, because the world is no longer seeing cricket in the way that we saw it when we were great. It is seeing it in a different way. So that when the government speaks about a cricketing industry, we now begin to understand that we are moving with the times. Mr. President, I would like to wrap up my contribution at this point in time. But I will say, Mr. President, the government remains resolved and committed to a good society. I am here, Mr. President, to give support and a voice to the government's efforts. I do so earnestly and conscientiously, sir. I will continue to do so as long as I am able. I'm grateful to you and to the members for their attention. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Nichols. Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I beg to move that the Senate now be suspended for a period of 15 minutes to reconvene at, I can't see from here, 20 minutes, a quarter to 6, Mr. President.
Quarter to 6 would be...
I can't, the light is shining on the clock.
It's not 5:20. It's not 5:20.
20. Thank you, Mr. President, for us to reconvene at 5:45.
The question is that this sitting be suspended until 5:45 p.m. today. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Honorable senators against, please say no. The ayes have it. The sitting stands suspended.